I've got several questions in the chat, and if you guys have anything, please throw it in there. And I've got a whole series of questions of myself. So, um, but Michelle Phillips was wanting to know if you could talk a little bit about how people dealt with the KKK in terms of responding to that terrorism, both at the state level and at the national level.
Great. So it's a great question. So first of all, I would say that if you look at the black codes in Texas, black Texans were prohibited from owning firearms. So the opportunities for self-defense, it was illegal for black Texans to defend themselves. So that first question doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it was fairly difficult. In fact, selling a firearm to a black Texan during this period could lead to prosecution. Despite that, there were kind of local attempts to resist. The Freedmen's Bureau was fairly active in trying to find cells of the Klan in other groups. They were generally unsuccessful until the Ku Klux Klan Act was passed under the Grant administration. That, in fact, was that act that I was referencing with that Philadelphia headline that calls, Grant Kaiser Ulysses. And the Klan was functionally rooted out. The problem is, the Klan is in some ways a symbol for only one organization of many. It existed as a kind of organized attempt for Confederate soldiers to maintain sense of unit cohesion, to in some ways continue fighting the goals of the war, which one of them obviously was maintaining white supremacy. But just because you stamped out the Klan didn't mean you stomped out racial terrorism.
Well, so, and is it easier to think about, like, it's not, the Klan isn't the Klan. I mean, there is a Klan, but there's like Knights of the White Chameleon, there's Larry and his friends over here. Like it's angry ex-Confederates who can't vote. We're trying to use mob violence and terrorism to accomplish what they can't. So the problem in some ways is that they're not terribly organized. It's just these groups that pop up in different counties and different places. And so you whack them over the head. And with the 1871 Klan Act, you can do that more effectively from the federal level. But that it's a response to this broad angst amongst ex-Confederates because their ex-slaves are in power, they're not, and they can't vote and do anything about it.
Yeah, it is intimately connected with voting. We see that these rashes of violence do occur around times of election. And of course, another part of this question is, what I said before, is that there just aren't that many soldiers here, period. And those that are largely either, on the frontier, either the southern border or the western frontier.
Right, yeah. And there's also the state police, 40% of which are black, that the Republicans are using from Austin, which also really hacks off the ex-Confederates because now their ex-slaves are being sent against them, but with state money behind them, which really upsets them as well. So Brady wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the role that women played in Reconstruction projects. I'm thinking of, in terms of the Freedmen schools and things like that, but in a more broad sort of sense, women's roles in Reconstruction on both sides of supporting and against.
Yeah, okay, so, I would also start with education, that the kind of work of literacy was largely women's work during this period. So the creation of schools is mostly being done by women, both at the local level, and then we have kind of national missionary organizations that are going mostly to other parts of the South, but a few do come to Texas, send missionaries that are women that are creating schools. Also, when we talk about churches, the reality is that for the entirety of US history, the vast majority of the folks that attend church are women. So even in churches where you have male leadership, often the work is being done by women at kind of all levels. In terms of kind of formal politics, we on a national level, there is a conversation that's taking place about whether or not women should be given the franchise, and in fact splits a lot of progressive groups and kind of groups that come out of the abolitionist movement. Support for women's suffrage is fairly low in Texas, really until the 20th century, when it only really gains support when it's paired with arguments about preserving white supremacy, which is kind of another story about the 20th century. I don't know, Andrew, what would you add besides, teaching churches?
Well, I would also say like women's memorial organizations are a really big deal in supporting the Confederate cause. So there's been a lot of really interesting work that's been done about how when ex-Confederates are not allowed to participate politically, their wives and daughters are able to sort of demonstrate in their stead by memorializing Confederate dead. So you have this rise of Confederate kind of memorial groups that have political purposes, but because it's women, they don't get called that because they're seen as sort of that domestic Victorian kind of divide, which they're not actually. And so you have a lot of this effort to sort of like getting out in front Confederate ideas that are being brought out by women who are, in this case, very much opposed to the goals of Republicans during Reconstruction in a way that I think is really interesting to get women on both sides of that debate and discussion, so you can see the conflict that transcends even gender divides.
That was the last slide I cut from this, and I can't believe I forgot it in this moment. Thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, I'm just going to reiterate that that's incredibly significant. Is that the kind of, in some ways, the carriers of the lost cloth myth were women in this early period. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if you go by Hunter or Jay Hunter, Nelson, but we call you Hunter. Hunter wanted to know if you could clarify, when you say black codes, do you mean the same thing as Jim Crow laws?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is yes, but I would say, the Jim Crow regime will develop over time. In some ways, I guess it's the first creation of Jim Crow laws. Although, yeah, kind of. I think of it first, though, as a way of trying to preserve the institution of slavery as much as possible. And I think that there's an important difference regarding segregation that we would think about with slavery and after emancipation. In the era of slavery, the last thing that enslavers want would be segregation. You want supervision. You want, in fact, a kind of integration of white and black to maintain white supremacy to protect slave rebellion. So in some ways, the creation of the Jim Crow regime will continue to be kind of refined as emancipation is accepted. So I think of the Black Codes as maybe a first step in that direction, but it's a step that's mostly concerned with preserving the economic arrangements of slavery and the kind of social hierarchy of white supremacy.
And that's what I told my students today, that we're covering Reconstruction now, was that the Black Codes, as the book puts it, are kind of a precursor to Jim Crow. Jim Crow really starts with the separate but equal Supreme Court case, right? That's when is that when it really gets its name?
Well, so you're thinking, Jim Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, demands separation, and not in schools, but in railroads. But it's really railroads that begin these segregating, or these segregating laws, like 1887 out of Louisiana, which is a lot of what Ben was pointing at, craziness going on in Louisiana, is where the first segregation law comes out of it. As Ben was saying, these are both precursors. Most of the Black Codes get annulled by when the Constitution of 1866 gets thrown out from Texas, but then that spirit and that sense is what carries through and then gets codified in the late 1880s and really through the 1890s and early 1900s. And that's what gets confusing, I think, for our students, is to see that sort of like long arc, but at the same time, the laws that we think of as Jim Crow get enacted a couple decades later, as they're bringing back into force what ex-Confederates tried to bring into force right after the Civil War itself.
Yeah, I want to say two things quickly. One is, I don't know if it came in as clearly as I would have liked it to in this brief little talk, but I like to talk about Reconstruction as this kind of moment of opportunity and then a backlash. So kind of undercutting a narrative of linearity or of declension, but actually showing that this was a moment of real opportunity. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing that we need to kind of keep in mind when we talk about segregation is largely it's a regime that's concerned with urban spaces. And urbanization is the other thing that's kind of coming out of this process. So, we've got a several decade process from emancipation to the kind of formal legal implement of segregation. And what's in between those decades is this kind of moment of possibility and then backlash, redemption, codification of white supremacy in the 1870s, and then the process of urbanization and the question of what do we do now, given the process of so many formerly enslaved people moving to urban spaces, even in Texas.
Very good. CJ had a question. I don't know if you know the answer to this. It's sort of like, it's kind of like a question that I think would be useful to know for talking to students about these things, about what was the punishment in many southern states for teaching enslaved people to read, which sets up a lot of, debates that happened with the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Schools and things like that after the war itself.
It's a great question. And this is a place to where, often the law exists not with necessarily a lot of kind of punishment attached to it. So I'll admit that my knowledge of this mostly is in Virginia. I don't know as much about what's happening in Texas. But I will say that in Virginia, the law is very rarely actually leads to legal action. It's more of just a thing that you can kind of threaten somebody with. And generally, it generally comes up when folks are breaking the color line. And having kind of, interracial relationships. This is a kind of thing that folks are kind of weaponizing against them. So I don't know actually how many even court cases we could find of folks being prosecuted for this, but sometimes a law can exist as a deterrent even without teeth. Do you know of any cases where it actually was prosecuted in Texas, Andrew?
No, not in Texas. I'd say it's very similar from what I've seen in Texas, where it's like, it's the basic same kind of code across much of the South. It's like, you can't do these things, but nobody's actually going around enforcing them, much like, laws against jaywalking in our United States doesn't typically get enforced. This is on a different scale, but like, you're not supposed to do it. It's illegal. Does it ever get enforced? I mean, occasionally, but usually because something else is happening and it's a threat that can be brought in outside of that, I think.
Yeah, usually it's directed at like white Northern missionaries that might have anti-slavery sympathies who might be present for missionary work. It's a way of preventing them from doing the work that Southerners see as a kind of impingement on their control of their communities.
Problem of outsiders, which abolitionists fit to the nth degree when it comes to the intellectual boogeyman of the South throughout this entire period. Very good. Well, so let's move into the document section so we have time to work our way through that.